Hello, geology enthusiasts. We're back again to talk more about geology. So I'm excited today to tie in some concepts that we've already talked about. So that includes minerals, the rock cycle, and relative time and geologic time. So today our story starts with relative time and the ideas of stratigraphy. So just to review, when we talked about relative time, we were looking at relationships. And I gave you the analogy of my family, and I said, Mr. Jovanelly, my dad is the oldest, followed by my mom. I have a brother Jim, a brother Tim, a sister Cindy, a sister Karen, and then myself. So I put those in order of oldest to youngest, with the oldest unit always on the bottom and the youngest unit always on the top. And then we can make relationships. So without knowing anything else, because they're in sequence, we could say my brother Jim is the oldest. I'm the youngest of 5. My sister Cindy is older than both Karen and myself. So that's really how geology was founded, and up until we overcame a technological boundary or a geological boundary of improving science so that we could absolutely date a rock. So we could find specific ages of rocks using an instrument called the mass spectrometer. We had to use sequencing to be able to understand geology. And that's really the basis of the geologic timetable in its origins. So I want to take you on a little bit of a history journey, starting with a fellow by the name of Nicolas Stenno, living 1638 to 1686. Nicolas Stenno was French. And just like we talked about many of the founding scientist of geology, he was a naturalist. As you remember, that geology wasn't really first designated as a science until 1863 when Charles Lyell wrote the Principles of Geology. So this is far before that, 1638 to 1686, and Nicolas Stenno is not classically trained as a geologist, so he's a naturalist, but he is working as a laborer, and what he's doing is he's digging ditches for waterways in France, canals. And as he's doing that, he's noticing that as he goes deeper, the layers of the soil are changing in color and they're changing in composition. And so Nicolas Stenno is known to be the father of stratigraphy, and stratigraphy is the science of looking at the individual layers of rock or sediment. So he founds this, and he writes about this as he's going through the process of looking at the stratigraphy and as it changes as he goes deeper. And as I mentioned, we can make some stratigraphic and relative time coordination with the geologic timetable that we've first been introduced with, looking at the oldest layer of time or oldest unit of time is the Precambrian, and working our way up to the Quaternary. So even if the age dates weren't on this, we could still make some type of relationships based on the stratigraphy of what we know as a geologic timetable. So back to Nicolas Stenno, remembering that he's digging these ditches, and he writes a manuscript where he talks about stratigraphic correlation. And this is foundational principles that we still use today in geology. And these are principles that Charles Lyell used in his Principles of Geology in 1863, so in the very first geology textbook. So starting with the first principle outlined by Nicolas Stenno, he comes up with the idea of original horizontality. And so what this just simply means is that when rocks are originally laid, they are originally horizontal. So as they're deposited in their natural environment, they're not tilted, they're not folded, they're originally horizontal. And we talked about the formation of igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic rocks. So we can use the analogy of an igneous rock and that magma coming to the surface, and as it comes to the surface, it lays horizontally, unless there's pre-existing topography, of course. So we can look for changes, we can look for the stratigraphy anywhere around the globe. Here's an example of Capitol Reef National Park in Utah. And what I just want you to look at in this picture here is that you can see that there's different layers, and you know that they're different layers or different units because there are different colors. And so if we went closer to them and explored them, we could probably give them specific types of sedimentary names. But without knowing anything else, you would say that the oldest layer on the bottom is on the bottom, the youngest layer is at the top, and you can see that there's different units of layers. And that's the idea of stratigraphy. In addition, we said that the first principle of stratigraphy is that layers are originally horizontal. And in this area of Capitol Reef National Park, Utah, there hasn't been a lot of changes since they were deposited. So when you look at them, they're still originally horizontal. And in other places of the world, there's been things like mountain building. And so anytime you have regional metamorphism where you have collision that happens, you end up folding the rocks. And so in one of the pictures, you can see what's called a fold. In the other picture with the person, you can see an example of a fault. And so large landscape changes have happened in order to change the environment. So these rocks that are moved were still once originally horizontal. So the next is the idea of superposition. And superposition is just a fancy word for something that we already know. The oldest layer is on the bottom, the youngest layer is on top. So it's a principle of relative time that lets us make relationships based on positioning. And the third principle is the idea of lateral continuity. So we're looking at a picture here of the Grand Canyon. And if you look over to where it's labeled the Bright Angel Shale, you can see that the Grand Canyon is separating the canyon from the left side. So the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River. And so the Colorado River eroded the area that's in between. But with the principle of lateral continuity, it doesn't mean that that area once wasn't completely deposited because the layers were deposited laterally. It just means that erosion happened. I'll draw you another diagram here. Let's not do that. Okay, so let's say we have our principle of original horizontality. So we have these distinct units of geologic time. By the law of superposition, we have the oldest unit on the bottom and the youngest unit on time at top. And let's say that there's an erosional event like a river. And so a river comes along. I'm going to put this back in case you didn't see that. It's a little far away. Okay, so this is what we have originally. Oldest layer on the bottom, youngest layers on top. There's 3 different units. And so then let's say we have a river come and the river erodes a cross section. So the river eroded the area that was in the center, but that doesn't mean it wasn't deposited. It just means that something happened in the environment to erode it. And in this case, it's a river. So we can even put some water in there to increase our visualization. So lateral continuity means that it was completely deposited over an area. So not that deposition is sporadic, it's continuous. Here's just another example of that. So you can see in block A where the layers are laterally continuous, in block B they're not because of erosion. Not to say that they weren't, but that something happened in the environment to create them to be moved. So Nicholas Stenno writes about these. It's included in Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology in 1863. And then this forms the science of stratigraphy, and it's added onto. So we can make discussions about other stratigraphic principles, such as the law of cross-cutting relationships. By definition, a disrupted pattern is older than the cause of disruption. A disrupted pattern is older than the cause of disruption. So what that means, looking at this diagram, is that the layers called Lufgrad, Birkeland, Tarberg were deposited. So those 3 layers were deposited. The names are on the diagram before there was a granite intrusion. So remember when we talked about igneous rocks and we mentioned the ideas of dikes, dikes are intrusions. And so that's what this pink area on this graph is showing you. So all 3 of these layers were deposited before the dike was intruded into them. So that means that the pink area, what they're calling the contact metamorph zone, is younger than the layers it intruded into. Here's a visualization from Stone Mountain where you can see the white areas are dikes. And so you're walking on the surface and you're looking down at these features. Next is the law of inclusion. And so by definition, write this down, fragments included in a host rock are older than the host rock. Fragments included in a host rock are older than the host rock. So we're looking at this picture, and what we're imagining is that body of granite's moving upwards. So we're imagining it being like a body of magma. And as it's moving up through those layers, it's eroding the sediment next to it. So they're becoming included within the granite. So the granite's young, but the inclusions are older because they were there first. So the granite's moving up and it's eroding the sides of the outcrop, and it's including them into it. Here's another example from Stone Mountain, and these inclusions are sometimes called xenoliths. I'll write that down. The inclusions are sometimes called xenoliths. Cool name, isn't it? Xenoliths. And we're going to play around with all of these. So we're just really defining them first, and then we'll apply them. Our next idea is unconformities. So an unconformity is a surface or contact that represents a gap of missing time in the geologic record. So an unconformity is a gap in time. I'm going to draw you a picture here. So we can have 3 layers, and we'll label them 3, 2, 1, oldest to youngest at the surface. This is a tree. This is a tree at the surface. And we can say that, that this is location A. And then over here, some distance away, we can say 3, 2, 1. We'll call this location B. And false, I'm not going to draw it like that. We're going to say at location B, there's an unconformity. And so what you're only seeing is unit 1 and unit 3. So at location B, layer 2 has been eroded. Layer 2 is gone. So that means there's a gap in time. And if we could absolutely date the rocks, then we would know how long of a gap that was. And so either the layer 2 wasn't deposited at all, or layer 2 was eroded. So we don't have enough information to determine that here from our diagram, but those are the different scenarios. Here's a picture of the Grand Canyon, and there's huge conformities there from the movement of the Colorado River over millions of years. So rivers meander, right? So they're moving back and forth in their natural environment, and as they're doing that, they're eroding. So you can imagine the river eroding and then shifting over to another place and eroding as it moves downstream. An unconformity is also called a hiatus, and that's what you're seeing on this diagram. So they're showing you 2 different locations and a hiatus that is representing a missing period of time. They're also showing you how rates of deposition can change from location to location. So one location you can have lesser deposition, but still have those units. And then others you can have a lot more deposition, but still have erosion. So there's, like we talked about when we defined rates, nature is not always consistent, right? So there's some variability that can happen. I want to mention too that unconformity is a general term. So when we get to laboratory, we're going to really tease out different types of unconformities. So there's something that's called an angular unconformity, where if the beds are tilted underneath, so remember rocks are originally horizontal, something happened, they're tilted, that's called an angular unconformity. There's things that are called disconformities and nonconformities, and that has to do with the type of rock that's above and below. So whether it's a contact between a metamorphic rock and sedimentary rock, igneous rock, sedimentary rock, etc. So we'll tease out those ideas, but the whole idea is that something in the environment changed to erode a surface, and that surface is called a contact. So here's just an example of superposition, oldest layer to youngest layer. So you could already make relationships between them, right? So you could say that F is the youngest, E is younger than D, A is older than B, etc. And I'm going to post these next couple of slides online so that you can begin to practice labeling stratigraphy from oldest to youngest and applying the rules of stratigraphy. So this is what we will be doing in lab and then in lecture when we meet again. So just visually looking at the diagram that's on the screen, we can label starting at 1. So we'll put 1 on the bottom as 1 is representing the oldest. So we'll say schist is 1, sandstone is 2, siltstone Q is 3, shale is 4, limestone is 5, and then granite is 6. Why is granite 6? Because granite is 6 by the principle of intrusion, by the principle of cross-cutting relationships. So schist, sandstone, siltstone, shale, limestone were all deposited first, and then granite intruded into those. So granite has to be younger than those. And what you notice is granite didn't intrude into the conglomerate, so that's why we didn't list conglomerate next. So schist, sandstone, siltstone, shale, limestone, granite, conglomerate, sandstone, siltstone. So hopefully you're picking up what I'm throwing down. There would be an angular unconformity in between the conglomerate, shale, limestone, and granite. So you can see that line below where it says conglomerate, that is considered an angular unconformity. And that's because the rocks below the conglomerate are all tilted at an angle. So something had to happen to make them to tilt. And then I'll let you play with these. I'll put them on the screen so you can see them, but I'll include them in a file. There might be more boxes than what you really need to label. And I just put this diagram up here to show you that these are concepts that we really do use in geology when we're studying stratigraphy. So we really do go out in the field, we measure the thickness of the units, then we try to age date the rocks so that we can see if there's missing units of time. And where this becomes important is in the discussion of oil and gas exploration. So these are, I'm showing you on the screen, real examples of what a seismic survey would look like to define where the presence is of oil and gas. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here for today. Yeah. So we've talked about Nicholas Stenno and his principles of stratigraphy, the principle of inclusion, the principle of cross-cutting relationships, and we'll look forward to practicing these soon. So have a great day.